the chapters, there's some sort of clinical correlation along the way here today, too. So we'll talk just briefly about a few diseases, but those are never testable type items. All right. So last time we talked about the thyroid gland, the parathyroid gland, calcium homeostasis. We talked about the adrenal gland, not its famous role, which is to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, but some of the other important things it does, namely that it produces the glucocorticoids here from the middle part of this adrenal cortex. And then later on, we're going to talk more about aldosterone and the role that it plays. So you'll hear about the adrenal gland in the past. Oh, and I may not have actually said this last time. An old mnemonic for what the adrenal gland does is salt, that's aldosterone. Sugar, that's the glucocorticoids. It regulates blood sugar to some extent. Sex, that's the androgen hormones that come from the zona reticularis. And then the sympathetic is what comes from the adrenal medulla. So the epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's an old mnemonic to remind you of what the adrenal gland is responsible for. All right. So next up is the pancreas. And in reality, the pancreas really belongs in the digestive system chapter. And that's where we're going to cover most of its function. Because it's a pretty large organ. It sits... the stomach is actually right here. So it sits just inferior to the stomach and just lateral to the left of the duodenum. And the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. So it sort of sits, and it's very far back in the abdomen. It's actually retroperitoneal. In other words, it's not in the same cavity with the stomach and the intestines, large intestine, small intestine, liver. It's actually behind that cavity. So, in a sense, it sits just in front of the kidneys and just behind the stomach. But more on that anatomy later on. It has a, excuse me, people say it looks a little bit like a tadpole. It has a head here in the front. It has a squarish body. And then it has a tail that sticks over to the left-hand side. It heads over towards the spleen. It's a giant gland, but most of its function, 99% of its volume, is for the digestive tract. So primarily, the pancreas produces enzymes that break down the food that we eat. It also produces a bicarbonate solution that neutralizes the acid of the stomach. All right, so more on that later. So what about this 1%? 1% of the volume of the pancreas is, in fact, an endocrine organ. It produces hormones that are important for nutrient management, particularly blood glucose. So you've all heard of these, or at least the first one, and that's insulin. So insulin is the key that turns the lock that allows glucose into cells in the body. In the absence of insulin, most of the cells of the body don't bring glucose across the cell membrane. So if they don't bring glucose in, they can't use glucose for anything. So in the absence of insulin, cells do not use glucose as a fuel, which is kind of a strange case because glucose is one of the primary fuels of the body, of the cells of the body. So if there's no insulin, the cells essentially starve for glucose because the glucose can't get in. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that. One is the brain. The brain can take glucose in whether insulin is present or not. And that sort of makes sense because the neurons, the only fuel neurons can use is glucose. So it makes sense that they're outside of the control of this system. So, we know that insulin has something to do with blood sugar. Well, what does it have to do with? As insulin levels go up, blood glucose levels go down. And the reason for that is as insulin opens those doors, the glucose goes inside of cells, and then it's not found in the bloodstream anymore. So when we check a blood glucose level, we see that the glucose level is falling. Where's the glucose going? It's going inside of cells where the cells can use it as a metabolic fuel. So that's insulin. Its role is to trigger the utilization of glucose by the cells of the body. Its partner, or it's not really its partner, its opposite is glucagon. Glucagon does the opposite. It raises blood glucose levels, but it does so in a different way. Glucagon raises blood glucose levels by getting the liver to release glucose. The liver always has a storage of glucose. At least it does if you're not in a starvation state. In other words, if you haven't eaten for more than 12 hours, then maybe the liver doesn't. But outside of that, the liver always has a storage tank of glucose. So when the pancreas releases glucagon, the liver releases glucose. So we see an elevation in blood sugar following the release of glucagon. The other thing that glucagon does is it triggers the liver to create glucose. So if the blood sugar starts to fall, glucagon is released to tell the liver, okay, release the glucose you have because the body needs it. And also, liver, create glucose because we're going to need it. Because our glucose level is falling and there isn't any glucose coming in through the digestive tract. So we need to produce our own glucagon. And then finally, glucagon raises blood glucose levels by working opposite to insulin. And that is by getting cells to not use glucose. It means that there's more glucose available for other cells, like brain cells, for example. So glucagon and insulin, in blood sugar, they work opposite. But their mechanisms of action are not exactly opposite. Insulin turns or opens the doors for glucose, whereas glucagon gets the liver to do some things, to release glucose and to make glucose as well. But those two are important, as we'll see in a minute, in blood glucose homeostasis. And then in addition, the pancreas has a couple of other endocrine features. It produces growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which happens to be the same hormone the hypothalamus makes. And then it also produces this hormone, pancreatic polypeptides. You can sort of cross those out because all I'm interested in you knowing is that the pancreas produces glucagon and insulin and that they work opposite each other. So a person who has type 1 diabetes, in other words, is insulin dependent. Their pancreas no longer produces insulin or no longer produces an adequate amount. They're taking insulin from the outside all the time, right? Well, one of the dangers with that is that the blood glucose level can get too low. If you have too much insulin for the amount of food that you've eaten, your blood glucose level can start to fall. So many diabetics will carry an auto-injector, a pen, they call it, filled with glucagon, because glucagon can stop that situation from getting worse, from becoming a seizure or a coma or even death. So a lot of times if you have a diabetic who is not doing well, they're dizzy or they're fainting or they're acting maybe a little bit drunk, you can ask them, do you have a glucagon pen? And usually they have one on them. And you just sort of jam it into their thigh. Glucagon goes in, blood sugar levels go up, and they start to feel better. Now, that is not the treatment. They still need to go to the hospital. They still need to go to the emergency room because when that glucagon wears off, they're going to start spiraling the drain again. So anytime you use an auto-injector, whether it's glucagon or epinephrine or any other thing, you haven't fixed them. It looks like you have, but you fixed them temporarily. They still have to go to the emergency room and get checked out so that they don't, in a half hour or an hour, start to tank again, and now you've used their only auto-injector. All right. So where in the pancreas do glucagon and insulin come from? Well, they come from the pancreatic islets. So what does that mean? Well, the pancreas is sort of arranged in circles. So all around the pancreas we have structures that look like this. So essentially they're just epithelial cells surrounding a lumen. So we have lots of these, right? Like this. This is the exocrine part of the pancreas. These epithelial cells make digestive enzymes, make that bicarbonate solution that neutralizes stomach acid. So where do we find the endocrine piece? We find them in these spaces. So sort of between the circles, we have these little spaces. We call those the pancreatic islets. The reason they got called that is they sort of look like that under the microscope. So in our picture, here's one of those gland regions. Here's another. Here's another. And this space in between here, we call this a pancreatic islet. It has a number of cells in it. So alpha cells produce glucagon. They're colored yellow here. Beta cells produce insulin. They're colored sort of this salmon color or orangish color. Delta cells produce GHIH, and F cells produce that pancreatic polypeptide. All right, so what do I want you to know here? Glucagon goes with alpha cells. Insulin goes with beta cells. Why is that important? Because you'll occasionally get a board question or something that includes the word beta cells, and it's because they want you to know that it's the beta cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. And since diabetes mellitus is such a massive pandemic of a disease going on right now, every little thing you can know about diabetes is potentially testable. Not in my class, but in your future, board exams, certification exams. Because diabetes, particularly type 2 diabetes, is like hugely on the rise. So everybody in the healthcare team needs to know some things about it. So beta cells are what produce insulin. All right, and then insulin and glucagon are the two that play a role in glucose homeostasis. All right. Okay, so we touched on this already, but insulin reduces blood sugar. That's what it does. You give a normal, healthy patient insulin, their blood sugar will fall. You give a terrible diabetic who's got a blood sugar of 3,000, you give them insulin, blood sugar will fall. So it always does the same thing. Insulin causes blood sugar to fall. Why? Because it triggers a transport of glucose from the blood into cells. We think sometimes of, we talk a lot about the blood and what's in it. But if you look at the volume of the body, the vast majority of the fluid and stuff in the body is actually inside of cells, right? Which sort of makes sense. We're made up of cells. So doesn't that mean that most of the stuff that we're made of is inside of cells, and that's usually true. So anytime you can move something inside of cells from the blood, the level in the blood is going to drop, and drop pretty significantly. Because compared to the volume of all the cells, the volume of the blood is very, very small. So even a small amount of insulin can make a significant change in glucose levels because it triggers glucose transport into the cells. Now, it doesn't stop there. It also tells the cells to use that glucose for ATP generation. And that, of course, means that the glucose is going to be destroyed, right? When we make ATP from glucose, we smash the glucose molecule into CO2, right? So it's going to disappear. That is going to further reduce blood glucose levels because now not only is it shifting into cells, but it's being burned up and CO2 is being released from it. And then finally, another way that insulin reduces glucose levels, particularly in the liver, is glucose can be stored as a starch called glycogen. All right, so a little refresher. A glucose molecule is sort of this pretty little ring, right? It's a hexagon, 6-carbon ring. And, of course, it has oxygens in each corner, right? And we just happen to have, where is it? Is it still in here? Yeah. This is what it looks like chemically. This is not my model. Somebody left it in here, but I use it. So see how it's got the 6-carbon, 6-black ring there? So that's a glucose molecule. Anytime you have a ring-shaped molecule like this, there's a lot of energy in that because the ring is very, very stable. So if you break it, you get a lot of energy out. So this is one of the body's favorite fuels, right? Because it can get a lot of energy. It can get 36 ATPs from every 1 molecule of glucose. So a huge amount of energy. But sometimes we want to store glucose. And the way we do that is, all right, so we're going to take our fancy ring and we're going to represent it with a circle, right? Well, particularly in the liver and skeletal muscle, the body can do this trick. It can take glucose sugars and it can attach them together like this. We call this glycogen. And it's a glucose starch. A starch is just a bunch of sugars that have all been stuck together chemically. So the liver can take glucose and create ever more complex chains of glycogen. Now, the nice thing about glycogen is you can go from glucose to glycogen in one step, and you can go from glycogen and you can cut one sugar off also in one step. So it's a very rapid, it's like a battery for glucose. When there's lots of glucose around, the liver stores it up as glycogen, and then when the glucose levels start to fall and glucagon is released, we start to see glycogen is broken down and the glucose is released. So we have this, we can store it up and then we can release it. All right. So those are the glucose effects of insulin. Some other effects, when insulin levels go up, many of the cells of the body are triggered to absorb amino acids. The reason for that is chances are if glucose levels are high, it means that there's nutrients coming in through the digestive tract. So it means body, go ahead and build stuff because there's plenty of stuff around to build with. All right? Same thing with in the fat tissue, when the glucose levels are high and insulin levels are high, that's when we make triglyceride. That's when we lay fat down. Same idea. Chances are if glucose levels are high, there's plenty of nutrients coming in through the digestive tract, so you might as well store some of that energy for later. All right. Okay, so another one of our famous diagrams, homeostasis, right? So normally blood glucose levels are between 70 and 110. Now, even in the normal person, these can vary a little, but we're going to look at both cases. All right, so you've had a pasta meal for dinner, right? And pasta is mostly starch. Starches break down into sugars. Sugars get absorbed by the bloodstream. Your blood glucose level starts to rise, right? So what's the body's response to that? Well, the beta cells in the pancreas are going to sense that increase in blood glucose, and they're going to release insulin. Insulin is going to move glucose into cells. It's going to tell the cells to use that glucose for fuel. The glucose is going to get stored as glycogen in the liver, and then we'll get that increased amino acid and absorption and protein synthesis and fat production. All of those things together, particularly these top three, are going to cause blood glucose levels to fall until we get back down to homeostasis again. Once we get to there, the insulin production decreases and we have homeostasis again. So that's insulin reducing blood sugar levels that are too high. All right. So what about the other case? You haven't had anything to eat for 18 hours. Because you were running late for class, so you skipped breakfast. Your blood glucose levels start to fall. The alpha cells now in the pancreas sense that change. They release glucagon. Glucagon elevates blood glucose levels by doing these things. So by converting glycogen back to glucose, that raises glucose levels. Breaking down the fat in adipose tissue, those fatty acids can be transformed into glucose. They can also be used by the body as fuel directly. So keeping the cells happy, even though there's no glucose to use. And then increased synthesis of glucose in the liver. Because not only can the liver store glucose, it can make it from other things, like fatty acids, like amino acids, whatever the body has around, so to speak. The liver can make glucose out of that. So all of those things increase blood glucose levels until we get back to our homeostatic range again. All right. So we all know that insulin is related to the illness diabetes mellitus, right? And that there's two types. In type 1 diabetes, the pancreas no longer produces insulin. Now, why? We don't know. People have been researching this for many, many decades now. And we're still not entirely sure. We know that it's not just a virus. We know that it's not just genetics. We know that it's not just random because there is higher incidence in families and things like that. But what exactly causes the phenomenon of type 1 diabetes, we still don't know. It's probably multifactorial. In other words, you have to have the right genes, you have to get the right virus at just the wrong time. You have to have this challenge and that challenge to make this happen. But the bottom line is, when you go to look at the pancreas of a type 1 diabetic, they don't have beta cells. No beta cells, no insulin, massive blood sugar problem, right? Because if your pancreas doesn't produce insulin and your glucose levels start to get too high, there isn't anything the body can do about it. So what you get is you get this kind of spiraling out of control where the glucose levels get higher and higher and higher. What's interesting, particularly in type 1 diabetes, is the blood glucose levels are super high, right? 2,000, 3,000, in other words, many, many times what they should be. But yet the cells are starving for glucose. So it's this very strange situation where there's plenty of glucose in the blood, but because there's no insulin, the cells can't bring that glucose in and use it for anything. So, it's a classic example of there's plenty of what you need on just the other side of the door, but you can't get to it because you don't have the key, right? So that's sort of type 1 diabetes, and it usually presents as what we call DKA, which is diabetic ketoacidosis. And that's that situation where their blood sugar levels are very, very high, but essentially the child, because it's usually a child in type 1 diabetes, is starving to death because they can't get the nutrients into the cells where they can use them. All right. And then in type 2 diabetes, the problem is not that the pancreas doesn't produce insulin, it's that it can't produce enough to keep blood sugar levels where they should be. The reason for that one is multifactorial again. But one of the theories is the more adipose tissue you have, the more cells you have, right? Because adipose tissues are cells. And adipose tissue has a lot of insulin receptors on it. So one of the theories here is people who get a lot of adipose tissue, the pancreas cannot produce enough insulin for all those adipose tissue cells. So currently, one of the ways we think of type 2 diabetes, which the patient produces insulin but not in sufficient quantities, is the pancreas can't keep up. There's so many insulin receptors, and the pancreas hasn't gotten any bigger. The patient has gotten bigger, so to speak, but the pancreas hasn't gotten bigger. So at some point, it cannot produce enough insulin to actually affect enough cells to bring the glucose level down. Now, it's probably more complicated than that because type 2 diabetes is usually a part of this syndrome called Metabolic Syndrome, which all of you are going to hear a lot more about in your generation of healthcare because we're learning more and more about how heart disease, diabetes, obesity, diet choices, how all these things sort of fit together and create this phenomenon called metabolic syndrome that causes people to have heart attacks early, that causes people to have very hard to treat type 2 diabetes, and a whole list of other things. We'll talk more about metabolic syndrome when we get to the digestive chapter, but just insulin, famous for its role in diabetes. Okay, and we talked about all these already, so onward. All right, so this one is kind of from last time. All the following are, whoops, I forgot my tablet today. All the following are the result of thyroid hormone, except which of those? Let me see if I can, wait, come back here. We may have to skip questions today, folks, because I don't know how to do this without my device. Well, here, we can just look at the questions together. All right. All the following are the result of thyroid hormones, except what? So, question is getting at what does thyroid hormone do? Okay, so elevated rates of oxygen consumption and energy consumption. Is that true? Is that a thyroid system thing? Thyroid hormone? Yep, that was at the top of our list. All right. Decreased heart rate and force of contraction. How about? No, just the opposite. So the thyroid hormone has a tendency to speed things up, right, and make the body work faster and harder. So we're not going to see a decrease in heart rate. We're going to see an increase in heart rate and an increase in force of contraction. In patients who have thyroid hormone levels that are way too high, one of the things that kills them is heart attack, because thyroid hormone pushes and stimulates the heart so much that essentially it beats faster than its blood supply can supply for it, and it starts to die. We call that thyroid storm. All right. Let's go on, because I don't think this is going to work. See, we'll get just done early today. All right, so pancreas. Insulin, glucagon, that's what you should think for now. Later, we're going to add a bunch of other roles of the pancreas to the mix. Okay, so the pineal gland. The pineal gland sits right here in the brain. It has a little story behind it. When you look at the brain anatomically, there are not, everything is paired. In other words, there's a left and a right for just about everything in the brain. One exception to that is the pineal gland. So ancient anatomists, as they were exploring the brain, trying to find out where the soul exists, right? You know, we only have one soul, right? So we can't have, the soul can't live in a thing that has a left and a right, because we don't have two souls, we have one. So for a long time, people thought that the soul lived in the pineal gland, because it was one of the few pieces of the brain that was not paired. There's just one of them. Now, of course, we don't think that anymore. Now we know that the pineal gland produces melatonin. But what's interesting is we don't exactly know what the melatonin it produces does. So there's a lot of questioning. And every time there's a new book, like this is a new book that we're reading or working out of this year, there's always new information. So apparently they have found out that melatonin has some role in inhibiting reproductive function. Now, not, strangely enough, in human beings. Most of these effects are seen in animals, which sort of makes sense, you know, for your squirrels and your rabbits and your cows and your buffalo and things like that. They need to have their offspring at a particular time of the year, right? Because without that, the offspring is going to die. If you have a baby buffalo in January, well, it's probably going to die because there's not enough grass to eat, right? And so in animals, the pineal gland and the melatonin that it produces probably keeps the reproductive system in line with the natural seasons, you know, so that the offspring are born at the right time of the year. Now, for humans, that doesn't really come into play, so it may be that that effect doesn't affect us anymore. Some other roles of melatonin, it's an antioxidant, as a chemical, in other words. It helps to protect cells from what we call free radicals. Free radicals are just oxygen atoms with an attitude. They have an extra electron, so they're particularly good at destroying things. So like if you ever put hydrogen peroxide on a wound and it bubbles and all that stuff, that's a radical effect. Because H2O2 has two oxygen radicals attached to each other, when you add it to something, they split, and the oxygen just destroys anything that it finds. Yes?
Does that cause toxins?
What, H2O2 or hydrogen peroxide?
Yeah.
It is fine as a sterilizer once. Like some people will keep using it on a wound, that will increase the scarring. Because it doesn't discriminate. It will kill your cells as quickly as it will kill bacterial cells. Maybe not quite as quickly, but yeah, it's a good first cleaning, but you don't want to use it after that for just that reason. It increases scarring. All right, and then everybody knows, or scientists have known for a long time, that melatonin plays a role in circadian rhythms, which the cicadas are particularly noisy these last few weeks. I don't know if you've noticed outside, but usually they're just at night. They're all day long now. But we call them circadian rhythms because the cicadas have these cycles, you know, where they lie dormant for several years and then they wake up and they reproduce and then they do the same thing. So a circadian rhythm is just an on-off rhythm. So like our sleep-wake cycle is a circadian rhythm. We have some circadian rhythms that go all the way around the year. So in the wintertime, for example, and leading up to it, we have a tendency to put on weight. And then leading up to the summertime, we have a tendency to lose weight as we get ready for the hot season. So melatonin and the pineal gland play a role of that in that. We just don't have it fully documented. Like, we don't really know how. All right? So that's the pineal gland. Little comments about this little mysterious thing. Diabetes mellitus, I think we kind of already talked about a lot of this, but there's type 1 and there's type 2. Both share a common symptom set. Polyuria, polydipsia. Those are the ones that you see on board exams. So what do those words mean? Polydipsia is drinking all the time. And we're not talking about alcohol here. We're talking about water, drinking anything. And polyuria is excessive urination. There's a reason for that. When blood glucose levels get above 300, the kidney can no longer hold on to the glucose like it's supposed to. So a blood sugar level greater than 300 and huge amounts of glucose are going to appear in the urine. And, just like osmosis, if you take a very salty solution, right, water will have a tendency to follow that salty solution, right? It's going to follow in along behind salt. It will do the same thing with sugar. So if you have a very sugary solution, water is going to follow the sugar too. So that's what causes the polyuria and polydipsia, is as more and more glucose is appearing in the urine, it pulls water behind it, so the urine output goes up, and then as the urine output goes up, the patient gets thirsty because they're peeing all the time. So they're basically drinking water to keep up with their own urine output. So that's a classic presenting symptom, is polyuria and polydipsia. So like for type 2 diabetes, one of the common questions we'll ask patients is, do you have to get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom? Because oftentimes, if they're in that polyuria, polydipsia state, what they'll tell you is, yes, I have to get up multiple times, and I have to drink something multiple times at night too. And it's because they're trying to keep up with their increased urine output. So that's one thing. Obviously, hyperglycemia is the diagnostic test. That just means a blood sugar that's too high. Nowadays, blood sugar is very, very easy to test. So people used to, we can just use a meter to look. In the very, very old days, one of the reasons the diabetes got its name in the first place is the way this was diagnosed was the doctor would taste the urine and it would have a sugary taste to it. So diabetes mellitus is basically, it means sugary urine. There's another diabetes, insipidus, which doesn't have that characteristic. So thankfully, times have changed, technology to the rescue. We don't have to do that little maneuver anymore or have somebody else do it for us, so now we can just test the blood sugar and test the sugar in the urine. All right, let's see. So that hyperglycemia comes from either type 1 or type 2. We talked about type 1 already. That's where the beta cells are destroyed. Type 2 is the one that we're seeing much, much more of. It is intimately related to obesity and lack of exercise. So when you have that trio of too much body fat, not enough exercise, and a diet that isn't very healthy, your chances or your risks for type 2 go way, way up. And it's insulin resistance. So the body does produce insulin, it just can't produce enough of it. So why do we care? Both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, their primary effects are on medium-sized arteries. So an old mantra from when I was in medical school is diabetes is not a blood sugar problem, it's a vessel problem. In other words, the problems that patients suffer from with diabetes doesn't have to do with the blood sugar, it has to do with the effect of those high blood sugars on vessels. So what do we see? Diabetic retinopathy, a leading cause of blindness in this country, is diabetes. Diabetes causes blindness. Untreated diabetes causes blindness. If you keep the blood sugar levels low or normal with treatment, then that doesn't happen. But without that, diabetes untreated causes the arteries in the retina to deteriorate. As those arteries deteriorate, the retina deteriorates and blindness ensues. So that's one. Another is diabetic nephropathy. This is kidney failure. Same problem. High blood sugars over time cause problems with the vessels that make the kidney work. So as those vessels deteriorate, kidney function deteriorates. You cannot live without kidneys. So one of the leading causes of dialysis in America is diabetic nephropathy. Type 2 diabetes, undiagnosed or untreated, leads to kidney failure. Another is at the heart. Now, the heart vessels are a little bigger than the retina or the kidney, but still, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, unchecked, untreated, type 1 diabetes also, incidentally, unchecked, untreated, leads to a much higher incidence of heart attack. And here again, it's because high blood glucose levels attack vessels, particularly arteries. Once the arteries get attacked, the artery trouble that is what causes you problems later on. So retinopathy, nephropathy, heart attack, neuropathy. Nerves have arteries too, right? You know, nerves are alive. They're made up of cells. Nerve cells are very high energy cells, so they're very picky and dependent upon a good healthy blood supply. Well, the very same arteries that are the very same size of arteries that are in the retina and in the kidney also supply nerves. So as those vessels deteriorate from high blood sugars, the nerves start to deteriorate. So we get a syndrome called diabetic neuropathy. And this is where there's a loss of sensation. Usually it's in the feet. Sometimes it's hands too, but usually it's in the feet. Why the feet? Because the feet are at the end of the longest nerves in your body, right? So the nerves that are going to go first in a nerve disease are usually the ones that go to the feet because they're the longest nerve. So in diabetic neuropathy, the nerves die or at least become dysfunctional, and these patients lose sensation in their feet. Well, obviously that's going to cause a problem with walking, right? But another problem it causes is because they have no sensation in their feet get injured. They don't know their feet have gotten injured. If the injury gets infected, they don't know their injury has gotten infected because they're obese anyway. They can't see the bottoms of their feet. They can't feel their feet. So a lot of times we have what's called the diabetic foot, and you will encounter this in patients from time to time. And this is where the loss of sensation from this neuropathy, together with not being aware of infection in the foot, leads to these massive fulminant infections of the lower extremity. The leading cause of amputation in this country, particularly of the legs, is again uncontrolled, unchecked, untreated type 2 diabetes, because this diabetic foot is not always treatable. Patients who have diabetes are much more prone to infection anyway, which sort of makes sense, you know, if when you have taken microbiology, if you haven't already. Bacteria love glucose, right? It's a free and easy to use, nutrient. Diabetics are full of glucose, so they have a much higher incidence of infection, particularly bacterial infection. So we get this kind of snowball effect in the feet. So they have no sensation, they have poor blood flow from their vessel problems. You add an infection to that, and you can have an infection so bad that patients will first lose their feet, and then they'll lose part of their leg. Usually it doesn't go up above the knee, but it can. So the leading cause of below-the-knee amputations, type 2 diabetes. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about for now on this, and none of this is testable material, but your book talked about it, and diabetes is a hot topic, so I thought we'd talk about it, chit-chat about it for just a minute. Okay. So back to the topic at hand. All right, so that's sort of the list of hormones and the organs that produce them, right? Thyroid gland, parathyroid, adrenal gland, a little bit about the pancreas. We talked about the pituitary, we talked about the hypothalamus. All right. So some general patterns, like we talked about hormone 1 and hormone 2. Well, hormones can interact. Many cells have receptors for multiple hormones, which sort of makes sense, right? Because a cell needs to have an insulin receptor for the glucose issue, but it also needs to have a thyroid hormone receptor because most cells in the body do. So the relationship between the interactions of hormones have a couple of different patterns. All right. So one is antagonistic. One hormone may turn the cell up, and another hormone may turn the cell down. Right. So what we may get is a kind of moot point. If we have one hormone that turns it up and another that turns it down, that cell's activity may just not change. Right. So just like a volume control, many of these cells will have more than one volume control controlled by different hormones. Now, why would the body do that? Because most of the time they don't just balance out. They don't become a zero. It's additive effects, right? So instead of a 5 or a -5, we get a 3 or a -2, because the body can up and down it. Like we talked about with the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems last semester. Okay, so antagonistic. Additive, hormone 1 and hormone 2 may both do the same thing, have the same stimulating effect. So you get a 1 + 1 = 2. So the cell gets turned up 2 times as much because it got 2 signals from 2 different hormones. All right. And then some more complicated ones. Permissive effect. This is where hormone 1 has to be present for hormone 2 to do anything. An example of this is thyroid hormone and epinephrine. So without thyroid hormone present, epinephrine doesn't really work very well, right? So you have to have one in order to have the other. Why would the body do this? As kind of a gatekeeper. If it wanted to turn off hormone 2's effects, now all it has to do is turn off hormone 1, and then hormone 2 doesn't do anything. So it's a sort of lock and key system. And then the most complicated effects we'll just call integrative, and that just means that when hormone 1 and hormone 2 are both in place, you can have very complex interactions of those effects, right? So you're starting to get almost into like a nerve type system. So example, calcitriol, which is vitamin D3, and parathyroid hormone, when they're both present, that system can do much, much more than it can when either one is missing. So just some general patterns of hormone interaction. All right. So one of the most complicated hormone systems in the body has to do with blood pressure and blood volume. And you'd think, why wouldn't we talk about it here in the endocrine chapter? We don't really know enough about the cardiovascular system yet in this class to really talk about what this system does. But in chapters 17 and 18, and then again in chapter 24, we're going to talk about all 5 of these hormones and what their roles are. So we're going to come back to these. But like renin comes from the kidney, ADH, we've already talked about that one, right? ADH comes from the posterior pituitary, but we haven't really talked about what it does yet. And then aldosterone, we talked about that briefly. It comes from the adrenal cortex, but we haven't talked about what it does yet. So this is sort of a preview slide. You can see how complicated this gets, and we're going to tackle this, but we're not going to tackle it in this chapter. We're going to tackle it when we get to the cardiovascular chapters instead. All right. So growth of the endocrine system plays a major role in growth and development. The endocrine system sort of works at its best, not in things that have to change second by second, but in things that have to change over like weeks, for example. Because it's a slower system than the nervous system is, because it takes time for these hormones to get made. It takes time for them to have their effect. So growth is very much under the control of hormone systems. So in order to go from newborn to adult, we need to have pretty much all of these hormones working correctly. So anytime you have a child who is either failing to thrive, in other words, that's usually, we're talking about a baby, an infant, who's not putting on weight, or who's not vigorous, who's not learning, things like that. Or you have a child who's not getting taller, who's not putting on muscle mass, who's not developing appropriately. The person that you connect them with is an endocrinologist, somebody who manages hormones. Because almost always the problem with a growth problem has to do with this hormone system. And the reason for that is there's all these interactions and intersections. Without insulin and growth hormone, there isn't enough nutrients for the child to grow. Without parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, calcitonin, without that calcium system working correctly, well, the child can't make the right kind of bones. Their bones are too heavy, their bones are too light. You can't grow normally if your bones aren't growing normally. Thyroid hormone plays a massive role all across development. So in every newborn that's born in this country, we take a couple little spots of blood, right, and we send a little card to the state lab, and we test for a bunch of things. One of the things we're testing for is thyroid hormone level. Because if your thyroid hormone level is low as a newborn, you are not going to develop normally. And if it's not treated within the first 3 to 6 months, you're going to have irreversible brain damage, irreversible developmental damage. So one of the reasons that we check all newborns for thyroid hormone is without normal thyroid levels, growth does not happen. Normal growth and development does not happen. So you end up with sort of a catastrophic situation where the child just never can grow normally if it's not treated within the first few months. And then finally, to go from child through puberty to young adult, now we have to incorporate all those reproductive system hormones. So LH, FSH, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, the androgens from the adrenal cortex, all of those together with growth hormone and thyroid hormone all have to be sort of adequately right to go through that the maturation that is puberty, so from child to adult. So growth is sort of a special, most complex case of the hormone system in action. So just all that to say, lots of different hormones have to be just spot on perfect for growth and development to happen correctly. All right. And then our last topic in this chapter is this one, the stress response, also called the GAS, General Adaptive Response, or General Adaptive Syndrome. Now, this is not the, oh my gosh, it's final exam week, right? That's one kind of stress, and it does trigger the stress response, but what we're talking about here is a lot broader than that. The stress response is going to be triggered anytime there's a challenge to the body, whether it's mental, physical, whether anything that challenges your survival, your psyche, your state of mind, your status in society, anything that challenges that is going to trigger this 3-phase general adaptive response, or general adaptive syndrome. It makes use of multiple hormones, right? So phase 1 is the alarm phase. We call this fight or flight. This is the one you've already heard about. When you're suddenly presented with a challenge or something scary or frightening or difficult, the brain triggers this response that releases epinephrine, releases norepinephrine, and basically gets the body ready for maximal performance, right? You're either going to fight the mountain lion or you're going to run as fast as you can. And all that adrenaline gets all your body ready to do that. This we talked about when we talked about the sympathetic nervous system last semester. The resistance phase is sort of the new one. And this involves particularly ACTH and cortisol. So when there has been a challenge, one of the body's responses to that is to release cortisol from the adrenal cortex. And what that cortisol does, like we talked a little bit about last time, is it gets the body ready to survive. Okay, so fight or flight, you fought the mountain lion and you took some injury, right? Your legs busted, you've got a big old gash on your, on your arm, but the body still needs to be able to survive. So what the resistance phase does is it sort of postpones long-term perfection for short-term gain. You know, so if you're all banged up, well, the first thing you know you're going to have to get somewhere and get help, right? So in this resistance phase, your glucose levels are increased and your immune system is turned down. So that instead of your legs swelling up all big so you can't move, the swelling is reduced so you can get somewhere else. Your blood glucose levels are kept high so that you have enough nutrients to accomplish what you need to after you have dealt with whatever the challenge was in the alarm phase. And then in the exhaustion phase, this is when everything is run out. You know, if you took those hits and you couldn't get to help, at some point, you know, you're going to be sort of sprawled out on the ground in the woods, right? Well, that's the exhaustion phase. Your body is out of tricks. It's out of things it can do to help you survive. And this is the point where things start to shut down. You know, cardiovascular collapse, respiratory collapse, and eventually death will ensue at the end here. All right? Sorry, I wish we had more time to talk about this because it's a good one, but we're out of time for today. So do read these. This is a great depiction of this stress response in your book. So you'll get just as much from it, I think, reading it after class. All right, thank you, everybody. We didn't get to